this session I've called Breathe, because it's about the breath. It's about, well, let's look here, looking at the effects of breathing on the nervous system, but also the effects of the nervous system on breathing. I'm going to invite us to do a bit of breath regulation practice, so we can put that theory into practice. And then after that, we can consider a bit on how we might introduce this to clients if we do, when we might introduce it to clients if we do, what it might be useful for, or just how we might use it for ourselves as practitioners and therapists. So we'll look at the theory, look at the practice, and then hopefully you can take away from it whatever you want to apply to your own practice. Here we go. So think of this as theory, but also I would invite you to consider what out of this you could take to offer as psychoeducation to clients if you wanted to, and if you thought it might be helpful. So let's start with the nervous system. We've got our central nervous system, which is our brain and our spine, but then we have our peripheral nervous system, because our nerves go all over our body, right? I couldn't move my arms and hands if there weren't any nerves there connected to the muscles. But that peripheral nervous system you can think of as in two parts. You've got your voluntary nervous system, or sometimes called your sensory or your motor sensory nervous system. So that allows me to do things by choice, like waving my arm to you. I can choose to do that, and it's voluntary. But then you have your autonomic nervous system, and that autonomic basically means it's involuntary. And this is what your nervous system does to all the parts of your body, not by choice, out of control. So if you look here at these pictures, we've got your pupils dilating, your heart beating faster. This is your lungs that might breathe at different rates and depths. I think that's a liver. What's this? Your stomach, so your digestive system and sexual system. So basically, this autonomic nervous system does lots of things in our body out of our control. And this autonomic nervous system has two parts. You can think of these two parts as the accelerator and the brake. So the accelerator is this sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system, and this makes us get up and go when our body feels it needs to get up and go. So if you ever feel stressed, nervous, anxious, frustrated, angry, that's your sympathetic nervous system revving up your body. And if you're ever feeling like everything's serene, calm, there's nothing you particularly need to do, and you feel relaxed, maybe you just fancy eating and lying around, your parasympathetic nervous system is very much online, which in general is great, because sometimes we need to rev up and sometimes we need to slow down, right? But, and just to go back to the brain then, when we perceive threat, first it's our senses, right? And probably some point in our brain it decides this is a threat, and the amygdala is the amygdala means almond, because it's an almond shape piece of our brain, and it's basically our smoke detector, which says, okay, threats happened, tell the rest of the body, tell your sympathetic nervous system to switch on, because we've just perceived that there's threat in our environment. And then, as you probably know, we have this fight or flight response. This is all part of our sympathetic nervous system. So sorry, this is probably far too small to read, but I'll just run through it quickly if you've not heard this before. So when our fight or flight response kicks in, what does our sympathetic nervous system do to our body? Well, let's look at all this. We might have racing thoughts because we need to make quick decisions. You know, if a bear jumps at you in the woods, you need to decide what you're going to do, and you need to do it quick. You can get tunnel vision because you need to be able to focus on the threat and either get out of there or focus on how you're going to attack. Your digestive system kind of shuts down, because if you're under immediate threat, it's kind of a waste of time to be spending energy digesting things. So you might get dry mouth, you might feel nauseous, you might need the toilet. These are all signs that you might get nausea or butterflies in your stomach. These are all signs that your digestive system's, on its way to shutting down because you feel threatened. Your heart will beat faster. So basically your body is trying to get as much oxygen into its muscles as possible so it can run or fight, right? And it will do that by breathing quicker and shallower, because if I'm breathing fast, I'm getting more oxygen in. That oxygen goes into the blood, and then the heart pumps it faster and gets it to the muscles quicker. So we have faster heart, shallower and quicker breathing. And you can get lightheaded or dizzy, because if you're not using that energy, you can sort of hyperventilate, right? So you might see this in people having panic attacks. You might kind of get dizzy or even pass out. Bladder urgency, that's the same thing as, just drop any dead weight and turn off your digestive system. Palms might become sweaty and cold. So basically all the heat's going to the major muscle groups and away from the peripheries. You might get cold extremities, might become sweaty as your body's expecting to run or fight and generate heat. And your muscles might tense up just so they're ready to do what they need to do. So we might relate to some or many of those symptoms. Our client might relate to some or many of those symptoms. And actually, for some people, just understanding that that's a perfectly natural human response can be, if they're minded in this way to like biology and theory, then that can just be very helpful and reassuring to know that these aren't bizarre things that are happening to them. They're perfectly natural. The sympathetic nervous system, then, it also actually ropes in not just the nervous system, but our endocrine system. Endocrine system is all about hormones in the blood. And so we get things like cortisol racing around our blood. I won't go into the details there, but why that's important is because the nervous system, basically it's runs off electricity, right? And so it can turn off and on quite quickly. However, our blood takes a little while to circulate. And so even if we calm back down, if we've been quite stressed and there's still that cortisol running through the blood, that might just take a little while longer to actually calm down. So it's worth bearing that in mind. What have I got here? An aroused amygdala activates the sympathetic nervous system, and an aroused sympathetic nervous system increases the odds of the amygdala activating. Anxiety can feed on itself. So yeah, we can get into this kind of feedback loop, right? So if we're already anxious, we're more likely to have anxious thoughts. If we're already angry, we're likely to remember other times that injustices has happened and get more angry. So it's hard to break the cycle, essentially. And everything I've said so far kind of applies to all animals, at least all mammals. But something particularly human is the fact that we have this really advanced cognition, right? A capacity for fantasy and conceptual thought. So we can actually trigger our fight or flight system just with fantasies and thinking, rather than necessarily the external environment being threatening. So this is a good picture demonstrating that. Clearly the environment is actually fine, but this fantasy, this worry, can trigger this person's sympathetic nervous system. And I suppose because we have the capacity to do this, for some of us, we have the capacity to be in this sympathetic nervous system a lot, much of the day. It can be very uncomfortable. And so if you don't remember any of that, the piece to really remember, there is one aspect of this autonomic nervous system which transcends both the voluntary and the involuntary, and that is the breath, right? Why? Well, because if you don't think about breathing, your body will do it for you, right? You won't not breathe in your sleep because you forget or whatever. You unless you have a condition, your autonomic nervous system will take care of your breathing, and you will breathe without thinking about it. However, if you want to choose to change your breath, like in the same way I can choose to wave my arm, you can also take control of it yourself. And that's kind of the only aspect of this autonomic nervous system where you can choose to do that. I can't choose to dilate my pupils on purpose. I can't choose to reduce or increase my heart rate via just choice. I can't choose to digest differently or send different hormones into my blood, but I can choose to change the rate and the speed of my breathing. And because of this feedback effect, if we change anything in here, it can have a knock-on effect to everything else. So I might have bored you a lot with theory, but that's the real key bit of information, is that this breath is like the one loop, the one kind of a kind of singly impressive way we can actually get into the autonomic nervous system, whereas everything else is sort of out of our control. Let's look at the breath then, shall we? So here's a few principles for how we might look at the breath. So what I'll do then is I'll go through each of these principles in turn, and maybe we can practice alongside looking at them. So the first and most simple principle we can do is we can simply just become aware of what the breath is doing. So I invite that for everyone now, if you want to. Just notice where your breath is at right now. Notice the way it's rising and falling. Notice where it's coming in or out of your mouth or your nose. Just see how it feels to actually be aware of and notice your breath. So it might sound obvious, but that for some people, that small piece of awareness might just be enough. But it's also, I suppose, necessary for all the other principles. So the second principle is like the steadiness of the breath. So if you imagine someone having maybe a panic attack, the breath can be quite erratic, right? Staccato, and it's not smooth. Whatever the opposite of smooth might be. And so we can take that principle and think, well, if we want to engage our parasympathetic nervous system, that soothing system, we might see where our breath is at and then see how it feels to make it slightly steadier than it already is. So I just invite you to practice that. It might be pretty steady already, unless you're particularly stressed this morning. I couldn't think of a better word than steadier, but hopefully you know what I mean by that sort of smoothness of pressure throughout the in-breath and then throughout the out-breath, as opposed to the sort of staccato-y, erratic breathing. So this third principle is the speed. So obviously, if we're in our sympathetic, our body is trying to get as much oxygen as possible, so it's going to breathe faster. So if we want to calm down, what we can do, quite obviously, is breathe slower. So once again, I notice you to become aware of your breath. See if it's steady and smooth, and if not, see if there's anything you can choose to do about that. And when you're there, I just invite you to make it slightly slower than it currently is. Don't make it so much that feels uncomfortable. So just, I don't know, 5 or 10% slower than you're currently breathing, and just see how that feels to do. It's nice for me to do this along with you. The fourth principle is the depth of the breath. What do I mean by depth? Well, there's a muscle just about here called the diaphragm. And generally, when we breathe in, the diaphragm contracts, which allows more room for the lungs to expand. However, if we're breathing quite shallowly, just up into the chest, we might not really engage that muscle much. And therefore, we don't take as deeper breaths as we otherwise are able to. So if we're quite used to being stressed and anxious, maybe we get very used to just breathing shallowly into the chest. Or perhaps if we've been concerned about our belly sticking out, we might get used to breathing into the chest for that reason. So it can feel quite strange, but to practice breathing deeper, what I invite you to do if you want to is to just put your hand on your belly and just see if you can allow your hand to rise and fall with your breath. Maybe slightly more than it otherwise would usually. This means we're just creating a bit more space for our lungs, which helps us breathe slower as well. And the fifth and the final principle is to have slightly longer out breaths than in breaths. Why is this? Well, our out breath is controlled by our parasympathetic nervous system and our in breath by our sympathetic. So if we spend longer on our out breath, that engages our parasympathetic nervous system for longer. This can also be quite strange and uncomfortable if it's new. So a little piece of imagery I've heard in the past that has been helpful for some people. So if you imagine there's a candle flame just sort of under your nose or by your mouth, depending on where you're breathing out from. And as you breathe out, your aim is to not blow out the flame. So you need to breathe out lightly enough that you're not blowing out that flame. And that basically allows us to breathe out for a longer period of time. So again, I just invite you all to take all these 5 principles now and see if you can engage them all for a few moments and see how that feels. Becoming aware of the breath, making it smooth and steady, slightly slowing it down, making it slightly deeper by engaging the diaphragm. And making your out breath slightly longer than they otherwise usually would be. And that's a lot of information at once. So I'm not necessarily saying you should tell all of this to your client in one session or anything. Maybe one principle, slowing it or just being aware of it, will be helpful for that session. But if you know all the principles, then you can help tailor it to your clients. Let's look at the challenges to this. Because like you say, the reason we might choose something like this is to help soothe someone. But what if the technique itself is a threatening experience? Then you're fighting fire with fire, aren't you? So for some people, concentrating on a particular part of their body, if they have trauma of that part of their body, will be uncomfortable. And like you say, if someone's having panic attacks, their breath might have become their enemy. And to actually focus on the breath might become really scary and uncomfortable. Yeah. Well, another thing to bear in mind is what we're trying to do here. We're trying to engage the soothing system, the parasympathetic. And there are other ways of doing that, aren't there? There's music, there's imagery, there's sort of mindfulness and body scanning, progressive muscle relaxation. Like there, so this isn't like the only tool in. And if for some people this is going to be the hardest one, then maybe play the easier path and go with where they're at. But I suppose balancing that with informed consent and knowing that actually this is a route in, and so yeah, obviously if it's triggering a panic attack, that's not going to be helpful, is it? Also, this is one of those things where we're not actually addressing the source of the stress, are we? This is like a, you know, if our stress is like a gas fire, we're not looking at the gas, we're just trying to help dampen the flames. And so in and of itself, this isn't therapy, is it? It's just one tool to help people with self-regulation. This is a piece of software called Breath Ball. Hopefully you can see that now. It is, I mean, there's a paid version, but it's essentially free to do what I'm showing you today. And basically it's a ball on a screen that expands and shrinks, and you can just use it as a guide to breathe along with. And so it sort of employs every one of those 5 principles on the screen that I had on my PowerPoint. And you can set the in-breath and the out-breath to whatever length of time you like. And so another technique you may well have heard of is called the 7-11 technique, which is called that because you basically breathe in for 7 seconds and breathe out for 11 seconds. And so obviously that's helping you breathe out for longer than you breathe in for. I did this yesterday, and I think for the majority it was a little bit slow. So I'm going to go take it down to 6-10 just to see if that's nicer for people. So that's done. And so, well, I can just stop talking about it basically. But if you want to try it, it'll be on screen. And I invite you just to breathe along with the ball. And then we can see how people found that. So if you want to practice this with me, we'll do it for 3 minutes. I invite you probably to take an in-breath now. An out-breath about now. And we'll dig in for our in-breath. That was just under 3 minutes. So lastly then, how could we apply this to clinical practice, do we think? We covered the first three, haven't we? Calming for the session, grounding at the end of session or intervention, tool for those particular circumstances. Some people may want to incorporate it as a practice in their life. This is kind of the way I use it, because like if you've not necessarily have acute situations, but you've just been chronically stressed for years, let's say, because of whatever attachment system, stressful life circumstances, you might not know what soothing feels like, and so maybe you might build it into your life once a morning or once an evening or something. If you do any sort of exposure therapy, you might use it there to help people calm their nervous system during those exposing moments. You can integrate it with other grounding and soothing tools. We got a minute left, so last thing I'll say is, if you don't want to use this at all with clients, but it's helpful for you, using it for your own self-regulation in session it can be really helpful. You know, a client gets angry or stressed and you don't know what to do and you're uncomfortable in session. Just having things that you can use to regulate yourself as a therapist can be really helpful. So there we go. Should we wrap up there? I'm aware people have to get to their clients and things, so let's say goodbye there.